Okay, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to Migration Christian Conference book launch webinar with Dr. Daniel Carroll-Rodas. He just recently wrote a new book, The Bible and Borders, Hearing God's Word on Immigration. When he had written this book, we wanted to take the opportunity for him to have the opportunity to share about his new book. And we had Dr. Carroll graciously visit us last year for Migration Christian Conference here in Boston. So we're glad that he's joining us here again to share on his new book. So Dr. Carroll, would you like to say a few words of welcome?
Well, thanks for welcoming me. It's good to be here with everybody again. And it's just good to be able to share about this very important topic. So thanks for having me, and I hope it's a good conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. I want to take a moment to give a special thanks to a person we have here on the call, Jeremy Wells. He's the Senior Director of Marketing at Baker Academic and Brazos Press. If it wasn't for them, this book wouldn't have been possible. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for being here and for the work of Brazos Press. So I'll go ahead and briefly go over the format for today's webinar, just so everybody has an idea and understanding of how it's going to happen, what the breakdown is. We will go ahead and begin with Dr. Carroll sharing about his book for about 20 or 30 minutes. I'll be asking him a few questions, interview style, about his new book. And then hopefully the last 30 minutes, we will have time to do some Q&A. So you will have the opportunity to ask Dr. Carroll about his book, The Bible and Borders. Feel free to begin writing your questions down during that time. Just a few etiquette remarks to keep in mind. If you could please keep yourself muted throughout the webinar. And if you'd like to if you'd like to turn on your screens as well so that we could see your beautiful faces. This will be recorded, so it will be posted online. If you feel more comfortable not being recorded, that's absolutely fine as well. And finally, the last thing that I would want us to know is during the Q&A, we will have, you will be using the raise hand feature. So if you have a question, please just go ahead and click at the bottom of your screen. We can go ahead and do a quick practice run. At the bottom of your screen, when you click on participants, there is the option there to say raise hand. So if everybody could briefly raise their hand really quickly, and then after you've done that, you can go ahead and lower your hand. That's how you will indicate with us that you have a question.
I just learned I never knew that, so that's good to know.
That's right. It'll make teaching the class much easier. Having
I didn't know that. Okay. All right. Just learned something tonight. Yeah, good.
Absolutely. Great. Well, with that, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for joining us tonight and speaking to us about this new book that you've written, The Bible and Borders. If you could take a few minutes just to tell us about this new book, what it's about, and maybe what inspired you to write it.
Well, let me just show it to everybody first. I just got my copy 2 or 3 days ago. But yes, what happened is I began writing on immigration in the Bible many years ago, actually. It was been over a decade now. And the first book I wrote was called Christians at the Border. And that first appeared in 2008. And then a second edition, which was revised, appeared in 2013. That was 7 years ago. And I've learned a lot in these years, just traveling and speaking and writing and listening to people. And so I thought it'd be good to update that material. And so what I did was I took the Bible chapters out of that other book, I updated all of them, and then I expanded them. So this book, unlike the other book, which had stuff about the history of Hispanic immigration and the history of immigration law into the US, this is just about the Bible. And so it's more focused and it's more up to date and broader and fuller than that other book. And so what I see is the continual need to inform the church about this, especially maybe even now. I hadn't really thought about it this way. As we move into election season, it might be good for people to get informed biblically about this topic and not just ideologically or politically. You've been muted.
I've been unmuted. Thank you. Um,
Okay.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll, for giving us that brief introduction. If you could share with us a little bit about your target audience for this book. I think one of the aspects of Christians at the Border that you had previously written is that it was written in an academic style, but also very accessible to the church. So in writing this new book, was that something that you kept in mind? And what target audience do you find yourself writing to in this book?
Yeah, it's really multi-layered, Danielle, because when you write something like this, on the one hand, you want to be academically credible. So the academics can find that kind of data in the footnotes or the endnotes at the end of the book. And so there's references, there's details of a more scholarly sort. But the text of the book itself, I wanted to make it accessible to the average layperson. Because what we need are for everyday Christians to have a better sense of this. But what hit me after the first book, and as I've traveled around speaking to majority culture Anglo audiences, but also to Latino audiences, is that on the one hand, for the Anglo audience, is to expose them to the breadth and the amount of material in the Bible, and it's massive. But I also, as I was writing it, I was thinking about the Latino, or even broader than that, the immigrant audience, so that they could be appreciative as well of the breadth and the depth and the amount of material in the Bible about migration. So it's not only to inform, and I think for many people it may be a surprise, but it's also to encourage the immigrant population. I mean, ideally, in the best of all possible worlds, it would also be in Spanish, and maybe we can keep our fingers crossed and that can happen one day. But so it's really kind of a double audience. Hopefully for the Anglo audience, it might confirm them in a biblical stance, or it might introduce them to a biblical stance. And for the Latino audience and other immigrant audiences, encourage them as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So in looking at this book, not Christian at the Border, The Bible in Borders, your subtitle is Hearing God's Word on Immigration. So that being the case, this might be giving away the ending of the book, but what is God's Word on immigration, or what would you say is the central message of your book?
Well, the title actually was chosen for a reason, because what ends up happening is that when people think about immigration, they think about the southern border, which is very important. But the history of this country is the history of immigration, but the history of the world actually is the history of human migration. So to reduce migration to the southern border, or to not even be cognizant of the fact that about 40% of the undocumented immigrants come in legally under airports on tourist visas, student visas, short-term worker visas. And also that we're seeing this is a global phenomenon. That's why it's the Bible and borders, plural. I'm actually trying to focus on this as a global issue. I've been in several countries the last couple of years. I've been in the UK and France and Spain and Australia and Argentina and Guatemala, and they're all dealing with migration issues in different ways. And so this is a global phenomenon, and it's a challenge to the global church. And so what I want to have people understand is that the magnitude of the issue and the centrality of the topic in the Bible itself make it core to not only Christian identity, but to Christian mission. And this is why it's so fundamental. So this is what I'm trying to communicate to the book, how it informs what it means to be a believer and what it means to be the church in a world that is actually seeing hundreds of millions of people migrating all around the world.
Absolutely. And I think just in hearing what you shared, I think something that people really appreciate about the books, or your first book, and really kind of the tone in which you write, is that you are providing a biblical, theological understanding of immigration, especially, as you mentioned, during this time, immigration has been politicized. And when people think about immigration, the only lens and what they view it and perceive it is through politics. And,
Yes.
and really, as you mentioned, what you do is you take a step back from politics and you view it as the larger lens of human migration. And once you view it in that lens, as you mentioned, you can begin to understand the theological voice, the theological narrative behind that, the biblical narrative behind that. And I think that is a voice that needs to be heard, especially as Christians. So many times we can be swayed first by political identities rather than our Christian identities or biblical identities, and really having that biblical framework sets us up
Yeah,
well.
and I would say too that it's being politicized by both left and right, and each side will have their favorite verse or verses. But this is bigger, deeper, and broader than either side even can imagine.
Absolutely. So digging a little bit more into understanding the narratives of migration within Scripture, what would you say is, in a sense, an Old Testament perspective towards immigration? What does the Old Testament say about immigration? And is that similar? Is that different than the narrative that you find in the New Testament? How do those two compare with one another?
Well, I think they actually complement each other, but they go in different directions a little bit. When you go into the Old Testament, in Genesis 1, we're told to multiply and be fruitful, but we're also told to fill the earth. And so, what that, in my mind, is suggesting is that humans, from the very beginning, are to fill the earth. And how do humans do this? We migrate. And so, this is what we have. The history of humanity is the history of migration. So, we would expect, and we actually find this in the Old Testament, of people on the move, whether it's Cain in Genesis chapter 4, who's forced to move, and he runs for fear of his life, all the way to the end of the Old Testament. It's about migration. And so we have the human stories of migration, and I think that's very important because one of the values I see in the Old Testament is there's so many stories that resonate with modern migration that people can find their own stories in the Bible. So we find the people of God, and we find God accompanying them on their journeys. And they journey for all kinds of reasons. They journey for food, they're hungry, they're fleeing warfare, or they're forcibly displaced for all kinds of reasons, just like today. And the importance of it is not only in the stories, but in the law. Because then we see in Old Testament legislation that God actually sets up a series of provisions to help those vulnerable people. And the immigrants get included with what's called the quartet of vulnerability. You've got the poor, the widows, and the orphans. Those are the three most people know. But the Old Testament adds a fourth, the immigrant. And all of them are vulnerable people for different reasons. And what you find in the law is that the law is offering provisions for each of those kinds of people. So it tells you that ultimately, and this is where the politics will eventually come in, that it's just not about caring for the immigrant in a general sense. It's not only about looking at those stories as stories that really transcend time. It actually tells us that eventually we have to move this into legislation. You've got to put kind of teeth into it. You've got to begin to organize it. You've got to begin to do something pragmatic and realistic and tangible into the discussion. And we see the Old Testament doing that as well. So we see all kinds of things going on in the Old Testament. When we go to the New Testament, of course, and you would know these things, Danielle, Jesus begins his life as a refugee. He's fleeing Herod with his family. And he goes to Egypt, and he's there for a while, living as a refugee. Eventually, they'll come back. When you find him giving the Great Commission, he tells them to go into the world. So he's actually commanding the church to migrate into all of humanity. And when we go into the history of the early church, and it's the history of planting churches all around the Mediterranean basin, and we see this happening in diaspora communities in all these cities in what was then the Roman Empire. And we see churches in the epistles wrestling with ethnic issues. You know, the Jews and the Greeks and the barbarians and all this kind of discussion. Well, why are they having that? Because God is putting together all these different kinds of people from all over the world, and that's difficult and sticky and complicated business. And so we actually see in the epistles this kind of thing coming to the fore as well. So from beginning to the end, we find the Old Testament and the New Testament dealing with issues revolving around migration.
Thank you. For those here on the call who are unfamiliar with Migration Christian Conference, the core of our vision is to explore God's heart through the stories of immigration, particularly the stories of immigration in Scripture, some that Dr. Carroll so eloquently described to us. Dr. Carroll, in kind of grasping that theme of understanding God's heart through the stories of migration, what would you say is one story of immigration from the Bible that you would encourage people to reflect on in order to truly understand God's heart for the immigrant today? If you had to choose just one.
Oh my gosh, that's not fair. Oh my gosh.
We'll give you two if you'd like.
Okay, all right, okay, that's better, but still not enough. But anyway, so I'll do one, which is kind of shock value, and then one which may be interesting because maybe people haven't thought about this before. The shock value one for me actually is Genesis 12. Abram is moved in from Ur of Chaldees, as that's how it's described in the Bible, which would be the area of ancient Babylon, that area of what is now Iraq. And he eventually will come into Canaan. So he's migrating, and as he migrates, he's given the mission for the people of God to be a blessing. So what you're seeing is God is telling them that as a migrant people, they will be a blessing to all the other nations. And then later on in chapter 12, after he receives that promise and commission, it says there was hunger, famine in the land, and he and Sarai, his wife, will move toward Egypt. And everyone knows the story, but oftentimes we haven't processed it well, because as they're getting to an area where they have to cross what we would say a border, or at least maybe some kind of checkpoints to move into Egypt. And this is very common in Egypt because Egypt has the Nile, Egypt has the water, Egypt has crops and food. So in the ancient world, people were always trying to come into Egypt during times of famine for food. So they're probably coming to one of these checkpoints, and everyone knows how the story goes, where Abram will tell Sarai, look, if they ask you, tell them that you're my sister and not my wife. Now what you're seeing is a desperate move by hungry migrants to cross a border to eat. So here's the great father of the faith lying to survive. And what's even another layer that complicates that story is we now know, and studies show this, and it's also if you just talk to people, the particular risk that women take in these kind of journeys. The potential and the risk of violation. And what you see is she is willing to literally sacrifice her body so that the family can eat. This is an amazing story. And most people have never processed it like a migrant story. The other one, because you gave me two, another very well-known story is the story of Daniel. I love that story. In chapter 1 of Daniel, the very first few verses, he's been taken away with his friends. And this is before Jerusalem actually falls. But he's well-to-do, he's well-educated, he comes from a good family. And he's taken to Babylon. And so from a distance, he will see the empire that he is now embedded in conquer his country, kill thousands of people, destroy the capital where he probably was from, destroy the temple of his God, probably killed a lot of his family and killed a lot of his friends. And now he's at the center of the empire. The empire has changed his name. The empire has put him into a curriculum to educate him to serve them. He is being trained to serve the empire that had destroyed his country and taken away everything he had and probably killed his family and his friends. These are the people he is being called to serve. And we never talk about what kind of emotions. Was it anger? Was it humiliation? Was it frustration? Was it a sense of hopelessness And then what we see him doing is negotiating the only space he can negotiate. And if you remember the story in Daniel chapter 1, they ask to be able to have their own diet. Not a big thing, but what it is a cultural marker. And what he's saying is, you may change my name, you may have taken everything away from me that I own, you may have destroyed my family and my country, you may have trained me for the empire, but I am still a Jew. He maintains his identity as a migrant, and even to the point of being willing to die for these kinds of things. And so what you're seeing then is a powerful migrant story in the book of Daniel. And the whole book is like this. And I could tell you more about Daniel, but you don't want to give me more time. I could keep on going. But I mean, the visions at the end of the book feed into this kind of idea as well, about giving him a vision of God. And in the ancient world, this will be the last thing I'll say, then I'll give you the mic. In the ancient world, if a country was defeated, it was also their God who was defeated. So in the mind of the Babylonians, the God of Israel was a defeated and powerless God. And what you see in the visions of Daniel, God is communicating to him that even though they were defeated, he is the God of history. And so what you find is this is also a theological exercise for him in a foreign land, which is, again, you can see how pastorally this would be massive for immigrants in this country, giving them a vision of God who is actually in control of their life and of history itself.
Thank you. And I think you have definitely showed to us what it means for the narratives of immigration in Scripture to speak to the narratives of migration and of immigration to our immigrant communities today. I think that is one of the most powerful things that this book does in helping us understand how these stories speak to the stories of this world today. So in writing this book, in reflecting as you have over this topic for a period of time and in producing this work, what is your hope for how Christians in the church will respond to this book? And how do you hope that this book will contribute to the conversations of immigration surrounding immigration here in the United States and within evangelicalism?
Yeah, the book, I think total with even the endnotes is about 145 pages. And so one of the things I wanted to do was make the book accessible, not only in tone and how it's written, but also in size, so that a lot of people would read it. And so my hope is that it will get disseminated and will inform people about how to think about immigration and about immigrants. And like I said, but for the immigrant reader, the hope is that they would be encouraged. And so that's what I'm hoping for with the book. What ends up happening with webinars like this is that, and this is not why I write the book, but it generates a lot of other speaking engagements for me. And so for me, this is like laying groundwork for further work. And what I've also seen, which is an encouragement to me, is that other groups and other denominations and other mission organizations and even activist groups have taken other writing that I've done, and I've already been told that they're picking this one up to help orient them in what they're trying to do. So part of what I hope for is not only servicing, so to speak, the broader Christian community, but also in some ways servicing those who are involved in immigration reform and local churches. And one last thing about that, Danielle, is that, when I was in another place before I came here to Wheaton College, I was very involved with all kinds of things revolving on immigration. I was doing, marching in front of the detention center in that city and all kinds of other things I was doing. But I began to realize that I didn't have the time or the expertise to do that. And so that I saw that my slice of this broader effort is the educational slice. And so that's why I do what I do, because I feel that's where I can contribute. Others are more adept at policy and more adept at pastoral work and more adept at all kinds of things than I am. Maybe at least at this part, I can contribute to the larger conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carroll. I have one final question for you, and then we will go ahead and open it up to the participants here on the webinar. I would be remiss if I did not bring up this conversation of COVID-19 in the midst of self-quarantining, of social distancing, and of closing borders. We live in a very different time than we did 2 or 3 months ago. So have you given any thoughts in how this book can begin to apply within this new reality that we live in?
It's a hard one. I have thought about it, actually, and had some conversations with some people. One of the things that I think is important for Americans, which sometimes doesn't happen, is that we don't have a global picture. And the US has closed its borders, but so have almost every country in the world. Right now, for instance, I'm half Guatemalan, as you know. That's why I have Rodas as a second surname. I cannot go to Guatemala right now. They will not let Americans in because America, the US, is seen as a carrier. So no US, people can go in. Interestingly and ironically, it's been the Guatemalans who've been deported into Guatemala that have brought the virus. I'd never thought of it that way, but that's what the Guatemalan press is saying. So that's interesting. I think when we talk about immigration and immigrants and the virus, it almost is important to distinguish between the undocumented and those who have status, because the undocumented will not receive that stimulus check from the US government. They cannot apply for social services. A lot of them are daily workers or working with the cash economy, or they're working without a proper contract. They have no kind of social net. And so those are the ones that really worry me the most, because where do they turn? And so I'm hoping that the church will step up and be willing to share and carry some of that load and need, not only in terms of prayer, but also in tangible giving. But that's the part that is important. The other thing that I've seen with a couple of colleagues, I'm changing from the Latino immigrant community now, who come from Asian backgrounds, where their spouse is an Asian American or an Asian Canadian. I'm thinking of one particular spouse. And they have actually been the brunt of some attacks because the reaction against Asians. I mean, so it's very layered. What immigrant group are you talking about? What kind of status do they have? Do they have any access to health care or even just food and any kind of income? If you're working on a day-to-day basis and a cash income and all of a sudden you're cut, and you don't, the idea of having any savings account or anything like that, that's just not on the table. I've talked to a good friend of mine in Denver who's a pastor. He was my pastor in Denver when I was there. And he was saying that the church is kind of rallying around their own people. But here's an example of what has happened, at least with one couple that I know, is that because there's a fear of even reporting to a hospital because they're undocumented, they almost wait till it's very late in the process of the virus. And so this one family that I know, the husband, he gets to the hospital, they put him on a ventilator because he waited that long because of the fear, you see, of what might happen if he shows up. Will they report me? Will they do something? And even if we say, oh, that's not going to happen, that's not a well-founded, fear, it is very real. So you've got all these other things going on kind of behind the curtain that I think we need to be aware of.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Carroll. At this moment, we will go ahead and open it up for questions. If you have a question, please go ahead and use that nifty hand-raising tool that we practiced at the beginning of the call. Obviously, we will not have the opportunity to call on everyone, unfortunately, because we have so many people here on the call. But if you keep your hand raised, if you do have a question, and then once you've had the opportunity to ask it, go ahead and lower your hand. One final thing, because we are limited on time and because there are many questions, we ask that you ask questions and not sermons. So if you could keep the question to about 30 seconds at most, at very most, that would be great. So I see here that we have a question from John Garcia. So John, if you could go ahead and, or well, you will be unmuted when you're called, you'll be unmuted. So John, go for it once you're unmuted.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Dr. Carroll, first of all, thank you so much for your work. It's been really helpful in my personal life and my ministry. So thanks for taking some time with us here. My area of research is in the New Testament. And so I spent a lot of time thinking about migration stories through a New Testament lens. And I've always thought that Philemon was a very good migration story, but I don't read much literature on that. So I'm just wondering if you could unpack whether you've taken any time to think about Philemon as a migration story and any thoughts on that in particular.
Well, as an Old Testament prof, I would say, I'm sorry to hear that you work in the New Testament. You need to come over out of the dark side into the light. That would be the first thing I would say. Boy, Philemon, that's a hard one. It's complicated because you're dealing with issues of slavery and things like that. And you're asking this person to migrate back and to be accepted back. And that raises issues of return migration, which are very complicated. So if I were to do Philemon, which I don't in the book, just to tell you on the front end of it, I would process it maybe through the ideas of return migration and all the fact that Paul goes into such great detail about what to do and what not to do, I think is important. And you know, I've done some work on return migration back into Guatemala, for instance, and the issues of family and government, and because it's not only the receiver, you know, but it's the one going back. And so I think you see this with Paul. He's not only concerned about the one who's going to receive him back, but he's also concerned about, I think, encouraging, you know, the slave going back, because you can imagine in that kind of world. I'll give you an example in the Old Testament. Of the few laws that we find for foreigners in the ancient world, most of those laws in the ancient world were about returning runaway slaves. You see, and it was the duty of the other country to return the slave. You can see this gets very tricky. So I would say that's how I would get at it. I would try to read it, not just the spiritual sense, and we're brothers in Christ, and which is good. But why does he have to use that language? Why does he have to be so thorough in what he says, and so very direct in what he says? And I think that's unpacking some of that socio-historical background might give that story even more teeth. Yeah, and come to the Old Testament side.
The next question that we have is from York and Damaris. So go ahead, York and Damaris, once you're unmuted, feel free to ask your question.
Hello, Dr. Carroll. Good to hear from you again.
Yes, good to see you.
Here, both of us, we couldn't miss this. And more than a question, we just have a comment. And the comment is just to thank you again for being a voice about this issue. You touch areas that people like us who are working with the community on a daily basis can't touch. And you have the ears of those who don't want to hear us sometimes. So I just want to say that we appreciate that. And every book or article that you write or sermon that you give, we're always paying attention to, because it just helps us or it just supports the fact that, yes, indeed, the church has to make a difference. This is not a political issue. It's an issue full of values, and it has to represent the values of the Bible. So thank you.
You know, thank you. And you're exactly the kind of people that I was mentioning before, and it's good to see you again. Because for me, it's if we say it's about values, it's still about the immigrant as the target. But if we say this is also about Christian identity, about who we are, then it's back on us. If we talk about this is about the mission of the church, then it's back on us. It's not just about them, it's also about us. And I think that's important. And I know you understand all that. You've been working on this for a long time. But I think that's important as well. it's about us, not only about them.
Exactly.
Yeah, thank you.
For those of you who don't know the Mighty Senor, they run an organization here in Boston, a legal nonprofit organization where they provide legal consulting. It's a legal consulting agency called Agencia Alpha. They've been doing excellent work within the Boston area for, has it been over 20 years, the Mighties? How long has it been?
18 years.
18 years. So
Yeah.
18 years. So thank you so much for being on the call with us today.
Absolutely.
Our next question that we have up here is from Rudy Estrada.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me well?
I can hear you and see you.
Great, great. I actually wrote my question down so I wouldn't get off topic, but immigration is also prompted by the failures of the empire, ecological disasters, or policy decisions like NAFTA. How does your research on immigration also shape your views of the kingdom of God and the empire?
Wow, that's a great question. I think that's where it's helpful to understand that the same things you're talking about now are the things that you would have seen in the ancient world. You know, an easy one. If you're talking about the New Testament, it's the Roman Empire. If you're talking about the Old Testament in Israel, you're talking about Assyria, Babylon, Persia. These were massive world empires. And when they, you know, what we have, let's say, in this country is more of an economic type of empire. But in the ancient world, of course, this would have been military and conquering kind of empire. So you cannot separate these discussions from issues of politics. The story that I gave about Abram is about ecology. There was hunger. So the very things that you're talking about, this is where the Bible helps us, I think, because what we're saying is none of this is new. And that is why the Bible can speak to it. Okay? None of it's going to be surprising. It's a different empire. It's the ecological issues may be a bit different, but conceptually, the very same things that caused migration throughout human history are causing them now. Now, the ones you mentioned are very particular to the US. But if you were to go, we were in Spain, my wife and I, a couple of years ago. Okay, you have issues coming out of North Africa. You have people migrating from Turkey looking to come into Western Europe based on the wars going on in Syria, right? You've got massive refugee camps in Lebanon and in Jordan. You got massive refugee camps in Kenya based on ecological disasters in Eastern Africa and the civil war in Sudan. What I'm trying to say is we are mentioning particular things to this country, but you're also seeing the same kind of things in other parts of the world today that are causing migrations of millions of people. One of the things that we don't even get in this country is the numbers of people trying to come into this country are not very large. A few years ago, Germany let in 1 million people in 1 year. Okay. I mean, we have no concept of the numbers. We're talking about, some thousands of people on the southern border. I'm not minimizing that. But other parts of the world, you're talking millions. There are at least 4 to 6 million Syrian refugees. That's just Syrian refugees. I mean, we have no idea of the numbers. And so this, I think the Bible can help. I think the things that you mentioned need to be studied, but they can be correlated, I think, very easily with the scriptures themselves. And so empire, ecology, bad policy, oh my gosh. Exploitation of immigrants. I mean, look at Daniel. Exploitation, they change his name and they train him to serve them. I mean, how exploitative is that? Then you go to Israel and ancient Egypt, slave labor. I mean, how exploitative is that? And it wasn't about minimum wage, right? They were slaves. And then they try to kill their children. I mean, the Bible has seen a lot worse than we're seeing in this country, and that's what makes it so relevant. But thank you. That's a great, great question.
The next person that we have here is Addison Lorraine.
Hi, hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Thank you again. So I've noticed in my closest group of brothers and sisters in Christ, there's a split where some are okay with, as you said, providing for immigrants, making sure they have food, access to some type of health care or, some kind of financial stability. And then there's the other group that wants to be an advocate for them here as far as their rights and protecting them while they're here in the United States. And there's a lot of back and forth. And so I guess my question is, what is our responsibility of the church? Yes, we want to, with any family or anyone in our community, we want to make sure that they got some food, that they're connected to, nonprofit organizations that give stuff away, but is it our duty to advocate for them when it comes to the laws and protecting their rights here?
Araceli, is that your name?
Yes.
Araceli. I would say a couple of things. At one level, and the two things are at two levels. Okay. So one thing that I would say is not everyone is called to be an advocate. Some people are going to be, it's like people now are like sewing for masks or something. Okay. That's not changing policy, but that's important. And that's what they can do. And so I don't want to minimize the charitable impulses in the church, because like it or not, that family needs food tonight. So even if you're going to advocate for them in a more formal way, they still need food tonight. And so I would say not to make that an either or, but actually see it as somehow, if we can coordinate those two together and work together and realize that we're working on different levels, but both levels are necessary. The other thing, which is the larger question, this is that second level that I would say is this. In the Old Testament, you have Old Testament law, and I get to this in the book. And what you see is that God has a heart for the immigrant, because he actually says, you will love the immigrant because I do. And when I tell people this, I say, look, I don't have another bigger motivation for you, because if you can't believe that God loves them, then I don't know what to tell you. But there it is in the text. And it says, giving them food and clothing. It actually says that in Deuteronomy 10. So what you're seeing is God is motivating them to do this. But he's putting laws in place. So that tells you, what I had mentioned maybe 20 minutes ago, is that you've got to get to legislation. And I think the Old Testament gives us a moral compass about the kind of legislation that we need to advocate for. So I think, yes, I think the church should be advocating, but what happens sometimes is people go, okay, that's the biblical stuff, now let's do the legal stuff. Well, I don't think we don't need to separate those. Actually, those same values that you see in a certain shape in ancient Israel will take a different shape in 21st century US and may look differently in 21st century Great Britain. It may look differently in 21st century Argentina. Then it looks differently in 21st century Australia. But we can all base our legal thrust and direction with those values. And so I would say really make it a bigger package, and then actually draw from the law itself, the Old Testament law itself, to help us move forward in a biblically oriented kind of way.
The next question we have here is from Brian Christensen.
Thank you. Dr. Carroll, I guess with the last election, we saw, I guess, more populism come up where exclude refugees. Has this happened before in the US? And more importantly, has it happened before in the church at large, since we have a undocumented daughter-in-law, and the church I go to, obviously there's quite a few that Romans 13 and exclude the immigrant, refugee, foreigner.
Yeah, I would say this is nothing new, and this is where history is important. I actually have an article, and Danielle, if you remind me, I'm happy to send it to you. It's from Benjamin Franklin. And Benjamin Franklin is worried about the Germans, because there was a large German contingent in the colonies. And he says in this article, Benjamin Franklin. And he goes, he's worried because they're not using English in their schools. They have their own churches and their own stores and their own newspapers. And he's worried about the Germans being anxious. And then he says this, he says, and the German men, they beat their mothers. And you're like, what? But what you're saying is they get all this prejudice. And then he says, even more interesting, they have a different pigmentation than we do. So I'm going, do Germans and British look, the color is that different? No. Wow. But what you're seeing is prejudice even in the colonial period. And then, of course, you know, we import Black Africans. And look what happened to that immigrant group that we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. So has it been worse? It's been worse. We actually enslaved a whole group of immigrants that we brought over forcefully. And we're still dealing with that mess. And then, you know, if you go into the late 19th century, actually, you can actually look this up on Wikipedia, because Wikipedia doesn't lie, it has all the information, right? In Wikipedia, you can look this up. It's called the Know Nothing, K-N-O-W, the Know Nothing Party. This was built on anti-immigration. They actually had a presidential candidate. Oh, wow. But they were worried about Catholics. At the end of the 19th century, the worry was this was a Protestant country, and we did not want Catholics. And so that meant we put quotas eventually on the Irish and the Italians. And then toward the end of the 19th century, last story here, is that, you know, when the US goes to war with Mexico, the Mexican-American War, and you have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ends the war, the US assumes overnight 40% of Mexican territory. And then with the Gadsden Purchase, a couple of years later, we actually get another slice of Mexican land. 1848. Well, 1849 is the gold rush. So the US, both the government and private companies, begin to import Chinese labor to work the mines, to build the railroads, all this kind of stuff. That's why you have these huge Asian colonies, so to speak, in western part of the US. It goes back to the mid-1800s. That's why you have Chinatown, all this kind of stuff going on. This goes back 150 years or more. But eventually what happens as the Chinese begin to multiply, we called them the coolies at the time, is that there's worries, too many Chinese. So there's race riots in California. There's lynchings in California. And so eventually this will make its way up to the federal level. And immigration was not federal until 1875. Up until then, it was all states, which is the US tension between states and US government. We're seeing it even today. Who's going to run the virus thing? The states or the federal government? Republicans are saying the states, the Democrats are saying the federal government. That discussion in this country has been going on since 1776, okay? That's not a new discussion. It eventually will make its way up. Now it's federal. In 1882, we get the Chinese Exclusion Act. That will exclude all Chinese from coming into the country, except for very, very few exceptions. And even if you were born in this country and you were of Chinese descent, you could not be a citizen. That law was not rescinded until 1943. So what you're seeing is this anti-immigrant feeling is nothing new, and actually it's been worse. And there's a lesson to learn from the African Americans. When you mishandle and mistreat immigrants that badly and that cruelly, a century and a half after the end of the Civil War, we're still dealing with the racial and ethical repercussions of this terrible immigration thing that we did. And we're still living with it. And I don't need to rehearse that for anybody. So what I'm saying is the history can teach us a lot, not only the history of immigration, but if you also look at the history of immigration law in this country, it's very checkered as well. So it's been worse, sad to say. Doesn't mean this is good. It's actually worse than it was just a few years ago. But we actually haven't seen as bad as it has been. And we just hope it doesn't get much worse. So great question, thank you.
We have time maybe for one or two final questions. We have Tim Tsang here next. Go ahead and ask once you're unmuted.
Carroll. It's been a long time.
You know what? When I heard your name, I went, "Is
yes.
that the Tim that I know?" You're in the West Coast.
Yes, I'm in California, Northern California now.
How
It's been
are
a
you? I
while
haven't
since
seen you
Denver.
in years.
Yes, it's been a long time. It's good to
Wow,
see you
so
again,
good
and
to
I'm
see you, brother.
grateful for all the work that you've done on
Thank
behalf
you.
of biblical scholarship and immigration. I'll be quick. My question is that I've noticed that among white evangelicals, there's been a lot more interest in the theme of exile. And I'm just curious about how you would incorporate your studies of immigration in, and maybe in some way dialogue with that emphasis. Or do you see any kinds of areas in which we need to be careful about as we try to, as especially as evangelicals, embrace the exile theme?
Well, first of all, for everyone who's listening and watching, Dr. Tim Seng is a great church historian, so it's a pleasure to see you again, brother. This is what I would say to people who use exile as a metaphor, majority culture. You know, evangelicals, and I think there's truth to this, we are becoming marginalized, sometimes deservedly so, sometimes undeservedly so. And so there's a sense of being in exile. And I don't want to minimize that because I can see some of the correlation. And it's a biblical correlation. In fact, you know, as you would know, in 1 Peter 2, for instance, every Christian is in exile in a sense. But I would say two things. One is, when people sometimes use that metaphor, it assumes that they've lost something that they want to get back to. But the biblical metaphor for the church being in exile is that we are permanent exiles and that this is not our ultimate home. So this is where I think that exile use can be kind of turned on its head a bit, not to regain something that was lost, but actually to begin to claim who we really are. And then I think, you know, we are taught how to live as exiles. It's not something to run away from, it's actually something we need to embrace. The second thing that I would say to majority Christians who would use this is that for those who are, let's say, middle class, upper middle class, that want to use this, that is a metaphor. But for millions of people, it is actually a reality, a lived reality. So I think there needs to be a distinction here, you see, that different people will use that metaphor differently, and how close it is to their experience will also vary. So that's how I would begin the conversation. Depending on the audience, I'd have to do it very gingerly, but you know, hopefully move them just by pointing to the scriptures. And that's what. And one of the things that I try to do, and Tim, you're good at this as well. You try to be ironic, because you're trying to win them. You're not trying to argue and beat them on the head with it, because you may win the battle, but you lose the war. What we're trying to do is win hearts and minds, and that means winning the hearts and minds of those who disagree with us too. So I think it's important how we do it, as we share a different point of view. Thanks, buddy. Good to see you.
And we have time for one final question. And I believe that question will go to, I hope I don't get the name wrong, Kenya Layako Mendoza.
Hi, close enough. I'm relatively new to my scriptural studies. And so all your questions are like, you know, me, like very educational right now. I really appreciate it. I look forward to reading your book. I guess like maybe in my novice state, like it's obvious to have this question, but I hope you have time. So I would think like colonialism is its own form of immigration, kind of like forced upon, right? How do we like free the biblical connotation of encouraging a submission that is exploitative? Does that make sense? So like I know that's the use of the Bible instead of what the Bible is intended for. But I feel like there's enough people arguing that because of the Bible, we are exploited because of the way it's like, you know, person after person after culture after generation. So what's the healing piece of besides the, I mean, I like, what can you think of as an example of, direct me to a healing lesson, a healing piece for that argument, I guess. Because colonialism led to, which is frowned upon, led to a globalization, which is kind of a favorable movement these days, right? Like globalization is kind of, from my impression, it's an embraced thing. Globalization of culture, globalization of knowledge, technology, everything that goes into that is like, this is the time that we've been waiting for. But colonialism kind of had to happen for that to happen, correct? So we're seeing this turnaround. How can we implement biblical studies for generations that are turned off by it, that would think, well, like, just like, how do we then like implement like that? Does that make sense? Sorry.
No, that makes perfect sense. And so thank you. Let me say a couple things. The first thing is, from the very beginning in the scriptures, you find people arguing over interpretations. And here's the important thing. You see this in the prophets, and you see it with Jesus. Jesus spends his ministry arguing about interpretation. Because what is at stake is the understanding of God himself, and also what it means for the people of God. That's why so much is at stake. And that's why the prophets and Jesus and Elijah and Elisha, and you go on, they fight so hard for the truth, because ultimately it's a battle for the person of God and what the people of God should be like. So the fact that there are different arguments today and that people disagree about the Bible and how to use it, okay, that's as old as time. Got it. All right. So the question is the biblical truth about the true biblical God worth fighting for? And my answer is yes. Jesus himself, was that a cat? Okay. Jesus himself was fighting this, you see. So I would say the first thing is, don't be bothered by the arguments, because you should expect them, because this is worth fighting for. And so the second thing that I would say is, throughout the scriptures, what you find is, because the people of God over and over and over again have been exploited and enslaved and moved forcibly and all these kinds of things, you see God constantly encouraging them. And the very fact, this goes back to Dr. Seng's point about exile, the very fact that in 1 Peter, in other places too, but that's an easy one, 1 Peter 1 and 2, where migration becomes a central metaphor for what it means to be a Christian. What you begin to understand then is, the more you understand about migration and all the things that go with it, the more you understand about what it means to be a Christian. So now you begin to see that migration itself becomes a reason, you see, for understanding the faith. So you can begin to see how you begin to turn the conversation away from where it normally is, okay? So that's what I would say. I mean, there's so much more I could share, but I would say those things. Arguing over interpretations is old as time. I'm not bothered. In fact, it's worth fighting for. And then secondly, the people of God have always had this. You can go to the Psalms and read psalm after psalm, crying out to God. You see the book of Exodus crying out to God in the midst of their enslavement, and God responding. The book of Daniel is a great example of this, and there's other examples as well. And then at last, I would say that the Bible teaches us that migration is central for what it means to be a Christian, understanding it as a core metaphor. So I would say that's just the beginning of responding to your question, but it is a fundamental question, and I think it's a great question, so thanks for asking it.
Wow. Thank you, Dr. Carroll, for taking the time to share with us about your new book, for being open. Thank you to everyone here.
Who showed the book?
Yeah, absolutely.
There
absolutely. It is. We sent a link here in the chat box if you'd like to go ahead and pre-order your copy. Actually, no longer pre-order, order your copy, because it's officially released today. So you can go ahead and order that whenever you have a chance to dive in more. Thank you, everybody, for your boldness really just to dive into this conversation that can be very difficult. I believe that the spirit and the ethos in which this take place should be a model for how these conversations should continue moving forward. Before we finish, Dr. Carroll, do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share with everyone?
Well, I do. And just looking at some of the names, some of my Latino and Latina brothers and sisters, ánimo hermanos y hermanas, estamos en la lucha y que el Señor nos bendiga y que nos ayude. And so, we just need to keep doing what we can do. And we got to trust the Lord. This is at the heart of God himself. And I think that's why it's so important. So everyone out there who listened, thank you for all your good work. You put all these little pieces together and things can happen. So thank you for inviting me, Daniel. It's always good to see you.
Yeah. Thank you. You as well. So before we finish, two quick final things. If you enjoyed this webinar, it has been recorded. We will go ahead and post it on our Facebook page, hopefully by tomorrow. So I would encourage you to look us up on Facebook, facebook.com/Migration Christian Conference. Go ahead and give us a like, and I encourage you to share this webinar with on your page. Go ahead and share with your friends who you think would be interested in this topic. This is a very important conversation, and just giving a quick share can be a really effective way to continue this conversation and the good work that we're doing. If you enjoyed this webinar, Migration Christian Conference will also be having a similar webinar in 2 weeks with another author, Dr. Robert Cha Romero. Recently published a new book called Brown Church, 5 Centuries of Latina or Justice, Theology, and Identity. So we will be promoting that very soon. You will receive a follow-up email from us tomorrow with the link to this recording as well as the flyer for that. So we encourage you to stay connected with this initiative. We are here to help in whatever way. We have so many different organizations here on the call, and it's a pleasure to have all of us here together. So let us continue in this good work, and thank you for taking this evening to share with Dr. Carroll. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night.
Blessings.